Welcome to Widowed Too Soon, where real-life widows and widowers come together to share their stories of survival, faith, and the journey of finding hope in the darkest of times. Whether you're newly widowed or have been on this journey for some time, each week we're here to provide you with inspiration, practical advice, and the reassurance that you are not alone. You were made to not only survive, but thrive. And now here's your host, a woman who has walked this path herself, who finds solace in writing, joy in speaking, and freedom in dancing like nobody's watching. Michelle Bader Ebersole.
Welcome to Widow Too Soon. This is Michelle Bader Ebersole. I am so excited to bring you another episode with two guests. So you guys may remember just pretty recently we had on Debbie Soushek, and today we have her daughter, Katie Brasher. How are you guys today?
We're great.
Good.
Thanks for having us.
Yes.
Happy to be here.
So excited to have, I don't think we've never had this, a mother-daughter, except for myself and my daughter. But as someone that I've, interviewed. So we're super, super excited to we heard your story, Debbie. And so now we're going to hear, which I know we only heard like half. We've got to have another episode when you tell us like your dating and remarried story. So that's another time.
Right.
But today we're going to be hearing the same story, but it's different because it's from Katie's perspective. And the only other time we did this is when my daughter Haley shared about when she lost her dad. And so I think this is going to be so great for all of the widows to hear from the kids' perspectives and for other people who have lost a parent as well. Like, I'm excited for my daughter to hear this. And so, Katie, we're just going to jump right into this. So tell us about what life was like with your dad, like the memories you have before he passed away. What was it like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Life with my dad when he was here on earth was, just phenomenal. I always tell people I grew up in the most cookie cutter, picture perfect 90s Christian household that could have existed. I'm like, wow, I'm the third of four kids. My mom's a stay-at-home mom. My dad's a firefighter. We go to church every Sunday.
Right.
We have, hours long video footage from our Christmases of us opening up gifts and smiling. And that was our life. It was very fun. My dad was, he died mountain climbing. He was a great adventurer. And so we did lots of camping and family time together, and we would go boating and hiking. And life was wonderful. Obviously, things happen when you're, 4 or 5 and, the end of the world is when a toy gets taken away or whatever. But by and large, I don't have any negative memories of my life. I remember my life being very full, very joyful. I've grown up always knowing the Lord, and that I got to grow up in church and having both of my parents not only value that in our household by taking us to church every week and being a part of that level of community, but that also that they were individual models of what it means to follow Jesus and their relationship. And I never saw them arguing or fighting. There was a lot of peace. I feel very, very blessed. I'm extremely fortunate to have lived the childhood that I did.
Oh, that's awesome. And remind me how many siblings you have?
I have 3 other siblings. So I have 2 older brothers and then a younger sister.
Okay.
So I'm third of 4.
The third of the fourth one. Okay. And so tell us, here's a little side note I wanted to share. We shared it on Debbie's, but you were friends with my niece. Well, Luke's niece, my niece by marriage. How crazy is that?
I know. A super small world. My mom had called me out of the blue one day and she's like, you are not going to believe the craziest small world story that just happened to me. Yeah. Lexi was my childhood best friend. She was the bee's knees.
That.
We had so many fun memories together. So.
Oh, that's so awesome. So that means, how old are you now?
I'm 28.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Very cool. Anyways, I just want to remember to share that side note with everybody because I love that. Okay. So let's get back into your story. So tell us about the day that your life changed and how old you were.
I was 8 years old, so I'm
8,
28
okay.
now. So it was 20 years ago this past June. My other siblings were 12, 10, and 5.
Wow.
So I was smack dab in the middle. And yeah, I remember, we were talking about this earlier. I remember very vividly the last time that I had saw him or seen him was right before he had left for his trip. I was watching them pack up the truck and everything. And then I remember he came into the kitchen and was like, all right, I'm headed out, and gave me a big hug, swooped me up into his arms, picked me up, like big bear hug, going on a trip. And I remember not, really thinking anything of it other than
Right.
I was going to miss him for a few days. And then, he got in the truck, and then him and his climbing partner were driving off. And I remember my mom, my sister, and I like waving as they were headed out the driveway. And so in that regard, I am so thankful that like my final moment was one of love, and that I did have a physical, tangible goodbye. I think a lot of people don't get that, or a lot of people are worried about, if the last thing they ever said was, words of pain, or, I was just talking about the grocery store,
Right.
So I got to have a really solid, real hug that was my goodbye. And then I remember it's just, I can see Mount Rainier from my bus, growing up in, small town, being able to see it, and was like, oh yeah, my dad's up there hiking, and I'm going to see him in a few days. And I came home from school one day. It was a totally normal school day. And my brother and I were walking up the driveway, and I remember my mom, and it's so crazy. We were talking about this. I have extremely vivid memories of the moment I was walking up the driveway for the next 5 to 10 minutes. And then it totally cuts like black, like a movie screen. And I have nothing else. But in that 5 to 10 minutes, I remember walking up the driveway. I remember my mom was in gray sweatpants and had on these red clogs. They were her garden shoes. And my little sister was clutched onto her leg because she was only 5, so she wasn't in school yet. And so she had been home all day. She was clutching my mom's leg, and my brother and I are looking at her like, what in the world happened? And she just looked horrendous. I mean, just when you think about someone who is in shock and devastation, and she had, been sitting in this all day, and she had just had to tell my older brother, and there's all these people in the house, and my sister's been crying and clutching onto her for who knows how long. And so by the time that Matt and I got to the place where we were being told, there was already so much devastation and grief and conversation that had happened prior to us getting there, because we were at school. And I remember and just staring, wide-eyed shock. And she tells us what happened. There was an accident today on the mountain, and Dad didn't make it. And I remember being very confused by that. Like, well, is he? And I remember asking, like, well, is he going to be okay? Right. And she said, no, he's not. Like, Dad didn't make it. He died today. And like, I just was like, how do you comprehend that as an 8-year-old?
Right.
And so I remember my brother like took off running, and then was sitting on our front porch steps with his head in his hands. I don't really remember the conversation that I had immediately with my mom in that moment, but I remember being like, okay, well, time to go inside the house. And I walked in, and my house was filled with a bunch of adults, some of who I knew, some of who I didn't. They were obviously there to support my mom and my family. And I walked into my entryway. If you turned right, there was my kitchen. And if you turned left, it was the hallway to my bedroom. And I remember like scanning to the right and seeing all of these adults and just not knowing what to say. And they didn't know what to say to me. So I just turned left because I didn't know what else to do. And I walked down to my bedroom hall, and I opened up the door. I remember closing the door and just sitting by myself on the edge of my bed and just saying, no. I was just in total denial, total shock. And I said no over and over and over and over again. And then my memory cuts black, and I don't have anything after. I have no concept of what happened the following day. The following year is mostly a blur. I remember that my teacher at the time, I was in the 2nd grade. So I remember my 2nd grade teacher had come over. Everybody in my class had written me a letter. And so she came to deliver the letters to us. And I don't remember like actually reading them or being there with her. I still have them to this day. So I know what they say. But I just remember her being there. And then I remember the memorial service in and of itself. But everything else, like I look back on pictures, I don't remember holidays that year. I don't remember what happened. I don't remember if my mom's had to tell me, like, you know, did I go back to school? Did I not go back to school? What did we do that summer? Like, did I go to church? I have no idea. The only other memory I have in that following year, it was at some point. So my dad died 10 days after my 8th birthday. And so I had just turned 8. So at some point when I was 8 or 9 years old, in the next year to year and a half, I remember very vividly one time I needed to ask my mom something, and she was in her bedroom. And so, but I opened up the door. She didn't hear me knock though, and her door was unlocked. So I opened it, but she couldn't hear me knocking because she was uncontrollably weeping in her bed. And I remember I had my hand on the doorknob. My parents' room was like a loft, so I had to walk up a couple stairs. So I remember hearing this noise of like, what is going on? So I walked up the couple stairs, and I remember just staring at my mom, just completely unraveling, weeping uncontrollably in her bed. I just stood there in shock for several seconds, and then I slowly backed down the stairs, and I really quietly just shut the door. And I didn't tell her that I had seen that for years, but that was a very vivid memory that I have. But those three, so seeing my mom like that, and then being at the memorial service and my teacher coming over, are the only memories I have outside of that like initial 10 minutes that I learned that he had died.
Wow. It's like you had complete trauma brain where everything kind of, I learned about this recently at a class where it's like everything kind of disconnects from reality. And there's a lot of people who can't remember. Did you have some of that, Debbie? I can't remember if you had some of that.
Yes, to some degree. I mean, I remember a lot more details about the day and the following days and all of that. But by and large, it was definitely just a blur, a lot of it.
And so all my siblings said as well that everything was just a blur.
Yeah. And it's interesting because Katie said that, you know, after I initially told them, she remembers just walking into the house. What I remember, I also remember her brother taking off and running, you know, and sitting on the stairs. And she wouldn't let go of my hand. And she just kept saying, I don't understand. I don't understand. Just over and over again. What happened? I don't understand. And, you know, didn't matter how many times I explained it to her. She couldn't wrap her brain around it. My oldest son, you know, remembers the house being full. He was the one I had to tell first because he was in middle school and these two were in elementary. And he just remembers coming up, and as soon as he saw all of the vehicles and everything and saw me, he knew it was bad. He knew something was bad. And he just said he went in the house. It was full of all these strangers. He didn't know what to do. So he went downstairs to his room and just sat there and just kind of sat on the edge of the bed and was just kind of numb. And all four of them said that everything was just kind of a blur after that. They don't remember a whole lot the first early years. So definitely that trauma brain and that trauma response.
Right. And don't you find it hard as a mother you've got your own grief, but then I had 3, you had 4, you're trying to help all of your kids at the same time. Like you're trying to be like strong for them, but then you've got your own. I felt like it's 2 different griefs. It's like your grief for your marriage and your husband, and then your grief for your kid's father. Like your kids just lost their dad. Yes. And you're trying to balance helping them and surviving. And I just remember that being such a difficult thing. And like the one who would help you with your kids through the grief is gone. So you're solo parenting, helping them through the grief.
It was definitely a balance for me of, and I talked about this in the last podcast I did about, having that moment where I just had to make a choice to say, yes, I'm going to choose to figure out how to get through this. I can choose to check out and, you know, shrivel up and die and spend the rest of my life being bitter and wondering why. Or I can just take one day at a time, one step at a time, and, you know, choose to live for my kids' sake, to get through. And so it definitely became a balanced and a delicate dance of, having my own private grief, you know, like in that one that Katie witnessed. And I didn't know for a long time that they even knew, because I tried really hard to not be that raw in front of them, but at the same time to be, to set an example of that crying is okay. Grieving is okay. I remember crying a lot in the car when I was driving. I'd have those blindside moments where it would just hit you out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. And every time I'd start to cry, my youngest would just freak out. And she's like, Mom, are you okay? And, and I realized that at her age, at 5 years old, she was equating the tears and the crying as being something bad and something awful. And she was always terrified that if I was crying, then something bad was going to happen to me.
Yeah.
And so, she finally got to the point where I would say, no, honey, it's okay. Mommy's just crying. I'm sad. It's okay. It's okay to cry. It's okay to let it out. I can't control it. It just comes when it does. That doesn't mean anything is bad. It doesn't mean anything is wrong. I just have to do this. And so, but she was watching me like a hawk the whole time. Right. And I didn't hold back those tears from crying in front of the kids. Right. But I also had my private moments of, the gut-wrenching grief in the shower or after they went to bed. Right. Or I had to do that. I had to set my own stuff aside a lot of times to where it was until it was a safer time for me to do that privately. So it was a delicate thing to get through.
I have
and still process through with them.
Right. I have memories of actually Grandma Bader, my mother-in-law, taking the kids and just wailing when they were out of the house. And just that was the time. Yes, just like you, I would cry in front of them, but try to like control it a little more. And then when they were gone, then it was just like that deep wail that you can't explain.
A perfect description.
Like a deep wail that's from a broken heart. And just, wow, so hard. So Katie, let's go back to you. So you don't remember a lot of it. So tell me when you do remember, like maybe back to school. I know one thing, well, my daughter was older when she went back to school, but like the thing that bothered her was she felt like everybody, like nobody remembered, and they just, they had their dads. They didn't say anything to her. Did you ever feel like out of place, or what was that experience like for you? You were pretty young. What was it like?
Oh, immensely so. For everybody that's familiar with the Enneagram scum and Enneagram 4, I'm the most misunderstood thing that's ever lived. Like nobody gets me. And I think a huge part of that comes from my grief. When I was 8, I did not have the cognitive functioning to be able to process, not necessarily what had happened or even the finality of what had happened, but like just larger concepts like forever. Like it took me several years to really be able to grasp, I'm never going to see him again. Like, and I remember, initially, I was in the 2nd grade and I had friends. And so, I had all these people write me letters, and I grew up in a small town. And so everybody knew me. So when I went back to school, it was like, I was now the girl whose dad had died. Like I was like, we're all a part of the dead dad club, the DDC as we call it, so, and so, I felt like everybody knew, or, people were either like tiptoeing around me or they didn't know what to say. And I remember the following year when I was in the 3rd grade, we had Evening Magazine come over to our house and interview our family about what had happened. And I remember my teacher had announced it to the class, and I had a boy in my class like make fun of me for being scared of Mount Rainier, and I remember my teacher ripped him. So she handled it. Don't worry about it. She handled that. But like I remember in that moment, just obviously feeling, because I also would have a lot of people be like, "I'm so sorry," and so there was this constant wave of like, "I'm here for you." I did have a ton of support. I had great, community. And at the same time, it only takes one person to say something really wrong, the wrong way, to like really make you feel like maybe I shouldn't talk about this. Maybe I shouldn't open up about this. I remember the following year when I was in the 4th grade, so I was 9 or 10 at the time. And I was outside with a friend of mine. We were working just on a project. So I wasn't in my actual class. Out of nowhere, for reasons I can't explain, I just had this total breakdown about missing my dad. It was probably, as I was getting older and able to understand these concepts of like, I'm going to miss him forever. Like I'm not missing him because he's on a trip. I'm not missing him because he's gone right now. He's gone forever. And I'm just going to have to hold on to this like forever, this pain, and recognizing that. And I'm having this meltdown. And I had a friend who was adopted, so she never knew her biological dad. And in her own grief, she looked at me while I'm like sobbing, and she's like, well, at least you knew your dad. And I remember like, in hindsight as an adult, I don't hold that against her, because she, also as a 9 or 10-year-old, was going through her own grief of not knowing and missing her dad too. But it just kind of think I had enough experiences where it created this thing where I either don't know how to talk about it because I don't know how anybody's going to respond, but more than anything, I just felt like other people didn't understand what I was going through. I don't mean to do this consecutively, but when I was in the 5th grade, the following year, I remember being in the library, and it's like I have my own meet cute with Harry Potter. This is a true story. It was Harry Potter. It was just like face down. It had fallen off the shelf, and I went over and I picked it up, and I was like, oh, I've heard of this book. And I remember starting to read it, and I had sat down, and like time just flew away until the librarian was like, time to go back to class. And I remember checking it out, and I just devoured the Harry Potter books, and it became like my whole personality and my whole identity. I had like this shrine to Harry Potter on my wall when I was a teenager and all this stuff. And it was because as a 10-year-old, it was the first time I felt understood that Harry had dead parents, and Harry's had peers that didn't understand what it was like to he was angry and didn't know what to do with this anger, and this frustration that he couldn't do anything about the scenario, and that people were looking at him differently and treating him differently because he didn't have parents, and his jealousy of people that did have this family in a way that he wished he had had family. And that was, I remember, the first time that I felt really seen, and that I wasn't the only person in the world going through this, because even though I had 3 other siblings that were also going through the same thing and the same experience, every single person experiences grief differently, even if they've lost the same person. And so my siblings and I, we did not, some people do, and we didn't. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It was just the nature of what happened. My siblings and I did not like band together in our trauma. We grew in 4 very different directions. I don't know if it's because they're my siblings. I have never met a group of people, the 4 of us, that are simultaneously the same person and polar opposites all at the same time. We're extremely similar and so different. And so we didn't talk about it as siblings. We didn't grieve together. We didn't do things together to honor him. And so I felt very alone in what I was going through, both in my home and at school. And it wasn't anybody's fault that they didn't understand what I was going through. I just didn't feel like anybody really got it. And then when I was in high school, and now people are, those concepts are a lot more understandable, and being able to process through. And that's when you start thinking now I'm in high school, and I realize that my dad's not going to be there to walk me down the aisle one day, and all this dream that everybody has. And, I was joking with someone the other day, I've never had a contact in my phone under the name Dad. I've never had a dad in my phone, ever. You get a teenager, and I have my mom, but I don't have dad. I can't call my dad. He's not going to be there for me. And so that was hard. I remember talking to my friends about it, or opening up, at like either small groups at church or bonding nights for sports teams that I was on. And people just being like, okay, yeah, Katie, like, we get it. Your dad's dead, and, let's move on. Like, and that it was like old news to everybody. And it was like, well, that happened so long ago. And I'm like, yeah, but it's still relevant to me. Or the idea that, my mom got married to Dave when I was 10. And so a lot of people, I remember one time I was like, Dave, and I was calling for him. And I had a friend look at me, and like, it was just the most disrespectful thing ever. It was like, why don't you call him Dad? Like, that's so rude. That's so disrespectful. And I was just like, no. And I've always said that, Dave is not my dad. My dad is John Cahill, and he's in heaven, and Dave's not my stepdad or whatever. Dave is my Dave. He's always been in my phone contact as Dave. He's my, and that to me is more than just I know lots of Daves or Davids in my world, but when I say like my Dave, it's a title in and of itself. He's one of my parents, and I adore him, and he's my favorite person. And I'm so glad that he never tried to replace my dad. And I've always felt and my siblings would all say the same thing, that my parents did a phenomenal job of allowing space for that and, not the or, but the and, that, you know, my dad is my dad and Dave is here. My mom was married to my dad and they had this phenomenal love and all this thing. And now she's married to Dave and he loves her and he's a parent to us. And so, and I always say now as an adult too, that in the same way that I hate a world in which my dad's not here. And when people say like, oh, you know, I wish God would have chosen differently. I wish this wasn't your story. I wish this hadn't have happened. Well, now sitting here 20 years later, I would never wish Dave out of my life. There is no scenario.
That's
like
so
I would hate a world that didn't have my Dave in it just as much as I hate a world without my dad in it. And that's just comes from decades now, that's weird to say, decades now of experience and time and love. And, you know, when I met Dave, I was 10 and it wasn't like, oh, he was my daddy and holding my hand and doing all of these things. You know, he never played that role and he created his own role in my life. And, you know, we have our own relationship that's not your standard, you know, daddy daughter, but it's just me and Dave. And it's so sweet and it's so lovely. And so all of that to say too, that, you know, growing up, being okay with knowing that, you know, okay, my dad's not going to walk me down the aisle, and having Dave doesn't make that fact any less heartbreaking.
Right.
That doesn't make that any less devastating. You know, I'm 20 weeks pregnant right now and I'm having a son, and it's heart-wrenching to me that my son will never know my dad, even if he looks like him. You know, one of my nephews is like my dad's carbon copy, and he's named after him too. It's the craziest thing. His name is Jonathan Cahill, and he looks exactly like my dad, even though he'll never meet him. And so it's heartbreaking to me that, you know, my son will never know my dad, but he will also have Dave. He does have a papa, you know, and that grandpa role will be played. It will just look differently. And so I think allowing space for all of that heartbreak and that grief and that devastation, while also making space for the new life that I am living, and that life's not passing me by, and allowing that has taken me a very long time to be able to live in that middle ground, you know, because when I was 8, I couldn't wrap my head around any of that. Right. And even when I was 10 and I first met Dave, I was never against my mom getting remarried, but I also didn't know him. And there was going to be no way for me to get to know him without developing a relationship with him. And that, what I have with him now, I couldn't have had, you know, 15 years ago, because we have 15 years of deep relationship that I can now look back on. And so, yeah, it was definitely, there was never big, I don't have a lot of like really big grief moments or like big breakthroughs or, you know, oh, I realized this thing, but just a lot of time, a lot of sitting in that grief, a lot of conversation, and just knowing that I trust that God knew what he was doing when my parents got married. He knew what he was doing when he decided that it was my dad's time to go home. He knew what he was doing when my mom met Dave. And now walking into parenthood myself is terrifying and brings up its own set of all of these feelings of I lost a parent. And, you know, to this day, like, I will sit in my bed 20 years later and have panic attacks that you can't imagine about, what am I going to do if Caleb, who's my husband, what am I going to do if Caleb dies? Like, what if my story is the same as my mom's? How am I going to walk through that? What is that going to mean for me? I don't think I could do it. You know, or what if I die? And, you know, I'm like so concerned about my will as a 20-something-year-old, you know, but things that only you know, really dwell about if you've gone through grief, but just a lot of really big questions. And I am walking through that now. I wasn't crossing that bridge 10 years ago. I wasn't thinking about, you know, myself as a parent 10 years ago. And, you know, 10 years from now, I'll be crossing new bridges about what it means to miss my dad and what it means that he's not going to be here for things. And when I become a grandparent, knowing that he never became a grandparent, that will have its own set of things. And so I think just going through life, recognizing that there's always going to be new milestones. There's always going to be new moments where I'm going to have to process what it means that he's not here, what it means for me to miss him without missing out on the life that I'm currently living and the hand that God has dealt me.
Well, I think you're doing a beautiful job, with processing all this and then expressing it to us. Like, I have so many things running through my head I want to talk to you about. The first one is, I feel like it gives me personally so much hope when you're talking about Dave, because I've been remarried a year and a half and my kids don't have any problem with Joel, but they're not close yet. And it's not like that. And so you talking about this, like, 18 and a half years from where I'm at, or however long it's been, like, that gives me hope that someday they could have that close relationship. And he's never, and they're older too, he's never tried to be dad, and stepdad doesn't really seem to fit. Like, they don't really say that. And so I like how maybe someday he'll just be like Joel to them, and it will be its own relationship. And so that's super encouraging. And I know we have a lot of listeners who are remarried with kids. And so I know this will give them hope too, that, it just takes time to develop
Absolutely.
that. And I think it's really important that the new spouse does not try to be the dad, does not try. We went through blended family classes and did all this stuff and talked about, like, I'm still like the authority person. He backs me up. But he's always told them, I'm not trying to be your dad. I am your friend. I am another support person in your life. And that seemed to work really well. So anyways, that was super encouraging to hear that. And I wanted to kind of go back to your childhood. So something that was really big, I don't know if you and your dad did this, but Haley and my late husband always went to like father-daughter dances. And that was like a big thing. And then, Father's Day and all these things. Was that a hard thing for you? Was that something you guys used to do? Just curious what those kind of days were like for you as a child.
Yeah, 100%. I definitely think to like speak on for myself and on behalf of my siblings, I think really unique situation to have 2 boys and 2 girls. And, sometimes people will compare our experiences as if it was easier for one gender or the other, which is just ridiculous. Like what it's like for my brothers to not have dad there. Like my brother was sharing a story about how, after my dad had died, he set up a Home Depot bucket because he didn't have anybody to play catch with, and he would throw the ball into the bucket, and my brothers weren't dreaming about their future wedding and about how dad wasn't going to be there to walk them down the aisle, so we all just have very different, that father-son bonding. Both of my brothers are parents now, and they don't have their dad to teach them what it means to be a dad, what it means to be a man, and they have Dave, which is different and lovely in its own way, but it's not the same as not having your dad being able to share with you how to do that. And likewise for me, I remember even when I was dating and before I got married, people always say, oh, you marry somebody who's just like your dad, and I'm like, well, my dad and Dave have very different personalities. One of them is fire and the other is water. My dad was fire, Dave is water for sure. And so like, I always used to really stress about that of like, should I be looking for somebody who has a personality more, is that the right thing or whatever? We didn't do when I was young before my dad died. I don't remember ever going to like a father-daughter dance or anything like that. But we definitely, my mom always said that having daughters melted my dad's heart immensely. And that, because he is fire, he's this incredibly strong, strong-willed leader and all these things. And I remember trying to just process through what that would mean for me as I got older and being, I remember the first time I remember being really angry about it, really frustrated about it. I was probably a young teenager, maybe 13, 14 years old. And I remember it sinking in that I was never going to know my dad, that like I could hear stories about him, but I would never know him in an emotionally intimate way that I now know my mom, that I couldn't make his favorite meal. I couldn't tell you what it was or how he liked it. I didn't know what made him tick. I didn't know what made him laugh. I didn't know what his childhood stories were, because when you're, prior to 8 years old, when you're a little kid, that's not the dynamic in a relationship that you have with a parent in the same way it is when you're a teenager. And so now I'm a teenager and I'm able to retain my mom's childhood stories and know these things about her. And I can order, what kind of coffee she likes. I know how she walks and how she talks and all these things. And I can't do that. I don't know that. And the only thing I can do is ask, and not being able to know that for myself or discover that about myself. But when I look in the mirror, I see my dad. I'm the only one of my siblings that got his blue eyes. And so I have blonde hair and blue eyes. And so I look in the mirror and I can see him, but I don't know him. And what am I supposed to do with that? And it's funny now that, you know, I've had so many years to process through all of these things, and I'm so stressed out. And my husband, Caleb, is totally Dave. They're like the same person. It's so true that you marry someone like just one of mine. Because I realized, though, I didn't marry somebody who is like my dad because I am that. I am the fire. I am so similar to him. I am very strong-willed. I am a leader. I am outspoken. I am so many of the things that made him such a phenomenal person. There's so many traits that I inherited that I'm so proud of that I have. And so, you know, when you're younger, think, oh, father, daughter, I was looking for his qualities in other men or in a future partner, instead of really discovering that I had those qualities in myself, even though I was a girl. And even though, you know, even though I was feminine and soft and all these things, that I was still strong like he is and was. And so that was, I think that took me a really long time to grasp and wrap my head around, that I could be similar to him, and that it wasn't just my brothers who were similar to him, because, you know, they're giant. They're both over 6 foot tall, and they're both great leaders in their own way. And they're both great teachers. And, but that I could, and my sister's the same way. All 4 of us are very strong. And so it's really fun to see my younger sister as well. She's so strong-willed and stubborn and fierce, and she's a mountain climber and a horse rider.
Wow.
She's got all these phenomenal things that, even though she was only 5, that also, even though she's a girl, makes her so much like my dad. And so I think all of us being able to not only like keep him in memory by honoring him, like my both of my oldest brothers, both of their eldest sons are in some way, shape, or form named after my dad. And then my son will be named after my dad as well. His middle name will be John. So all of us, and if Kelly ever has kids, I'd be shocked if she didn't do the same thing.
Right.
So, you know, there's this avenue of how do we honor him in the sense that, you know, I still have pictures of him up in my house. I still share stories about him. His memory has never died in a more tangible, logistical way, but that his memory has also never died because he literally lives through all of us. That all 4 of us are his legacy, that we carry his traits, that we carry his love, that we carry his leadership, and that we're walking pieces of who John Cahill was as well, is something that I've been very honored to learn how to do well.
I love that. And you know, you're about to, you know, have your baby, your son. And how do you see yourself, you know, are you going to share stories about your dad? How are you going to keep the memory alive with him? I'm just curious how you do that.
Absolutely. Well, he'll be named after him. So when
so there's a big one. Yeah.
There's that. I mean, I still have, like, I'm looking at it right now. I have my dad's license plate was Climb High. If you can see it on the video.
Oh,
I have Climb High.
That's
tattooed.
awesome.
My sister also has the same one as well. My brother and my mom have talked about getting it tattooed as well. So I'll have a family like memorial tattoo. And I intend to talk about it all the time and, you know, integrate it in a way where it's just normal daily conversation of who, you know, Grandpa John was and who that was to me. And, you know, I think the idea that you grieve and then you're done grieving is just not true. No. That's just, you grieve them forever. And so even if it's been 20 years, even if it's been 50 years, my dad's life and legacy will always matter, and it will always have a place in my home. It will always have a place in conversation. It will always have memories. And that's another thing I love about Dave. Dave never gets weird when we talk about my dad. So it's like, you know, we can all be in a round table at Christmas and be like, Mom, what was it like this Christmas? And she can share a story. And it's not weird because Dave is there. And it's not like, well, why aren't we talking about Christmases with Dave? You know, that it's normal daily conversation, that he is a part of our life and that he will be a part of mine and my family's life forever.
Well, and to add to that, that was something that was extremely important to me with all of the kids, is that I knew that they were young, and especially with Kelly, she has, you know, 5 years worth of memories, as much as a 5-year-old can remember. So we told stories all the time. Yeah. We had lots of photos, we had videos, we had stories. And even in the fire department family and the greater circle of impact that John made, I told people, I'm like, I want to hear all of the stories, because every day I learned something about my husband that I never knew, because, you know, he was this phenomenal leader in the fire department, but he would go to work and that was just his job. And then he would come home and he would just be dad, and he would leave all that work stuff at work. And so I would hear, to this day, it's been 20 years, I will still randomly run into people that I haven't seen in a long time or somehow were impacted by him. And they would tell me a story about him that I've never heard before. And I love that. And so I've always said, keep the stories coming. We've got to keep his memory alive with these stories so my kids can know. And so it was never a taboo subject for us. We always told stories. We always talked about it. And it's like, you know, Katie's talked about the and over the or the both and, where you've got this grief and this joy that goes side by side, and they coexist together, and one doesn't cancel the other out.
Right. No, that's so beautiful.
We just talked about it. And I think that's been extremely healthy and helpful for all of the kids, to just tell the stories and to remember, and, you know, little things that they may not have thought about for years, or as an adult, they remember something that happened and they never connected the dots of what that memory was or the impact it made on them. And so it's a new discovery for them every time it happens too. And like Katie said, it keeps that memory alive.
I think too, in a really healthy way, in this, I'm really glad that, like my mom said earlier about how she was really present, like all four of us would totally agree that my mom was very present. And I never remember a time, like obviously I saw her crying both in private and in public or whatever. I always felt like I could talk to her about anything. It wasn't that she was emotionless, but I never saw her lose herself. Like it was never like this depression was so intense that she couldn't function. It was never like, hello, Earth to Mom, are you there? I never felt that abandonment from her, which made space for it. But I'm also on the flip side that it was okay to move on at the same time. You know, it wasn't like, okay, it's his birthday, so we have to, you know, make his favorite meal and do his favorite dessert. We all have to sit down. And I remember after a few years, it was like, we just we didn't do anything on his birthday. And it was like, okay, we were doing this very tangible way to acknowledge him and to commemorate him, you know, at all of these major holidays. And that would just kind of slowly, you know, dissipate over time, that it wasn't like we don't have to like make a spot for him at the table 10 years later. That's like, well, that's dad's spot and no one sits there. And like, maybe that's relevant. And I totally understand why some people do that, especially at the beginning when it's fresh and you're trying to honor that. Or the flip side of like, okay, well, it's been 2 years, so we're all just over it now, so we don't talk about it anymore.
Right, exactly.
And I think my mom did a really good job of having us be in the middle ground where we still always talked about him. We've always remembered him and allowed space for stories and allowed space for tattoos and pictures in the house and all the things, without it being this like forced awkward thing where we couldn't move on and make new traditions and make new memories, because life was never going to go back to how it was. You know, I'm 28. I doubt I'll ever go camping again in my life. I am an Airbnb person. I want a pool and a hot tub. Okay. But those were great memories that I had as a kid, and that's just not my life anymore. And that's okay. And I can honor my dad, whether or not I go camping, whether or not I have his favorite food on his birthday, that there's, you know, a way to live in the both in a healthy balance of continuing to honor without trying to force this thing to exist in your life.
I think that you guys you've handled grief in a really healthy way, and that Debbie, you set a great example for your kids. I try to do the same thing where we talk about Luke, we still do, like, oh, what do you think your dad would think about this? Or, you know, and just keeping it a safe place. I've talked to people who, I have a friend I'm thinking of specifically, her dad died in high school, and she said they never talked about him. It was like they just didn't talk about him. And I can think of other people too, and it's just so not healthy, because you want to be able to talk about them. It's fun to talk about them and keep their memory alive. And I love how you guys are doing that for the next generation, because that's what I have questions about. Haley recently talked to me about that. She's like, how is it going to be? Like, Joel's going to be their grandpa? I'm like, yeah, but we're going to tell them about your dad, and we're going to have pictures and stories. So it's, you know, we're in the stage, we're talking about what it'll be like in the future. So I love hearing like what you guys actually do with that. And I think that's, you know, such a great way to honor them. I remember right before Luke died, all of a sudden he started crying and he was like, I'm never going to know my grandkids. And I just like that hit me and I was like, whoa. Yeah. And so I have a really hard time with that, that concept. So I love to see how you guys are doing. I think that's beautiful. Yeah. I'd love to hear about other days growing up that were hard grief days. Like what was it? You touched on a little bit about your like, what was your wedding day, graduation, or maybe other days that were hard and how you honored your dad and what that was like?
Yeah, I feel like I remember my mom shared this in her podcast with you earlier, that it's almost like you put so much energy into preparing for the big days that it doesn't actually hit you on that day. And then like a Tuesday later, you just have a total meltdown about it. And that's very true. For me, I remember, gearing up every year for June 3rd is the day that he passed. And so I'm like, every year on June 3rd, it's like, okay, June 3rd. And even all my friends, all my really close friends would be like, okay, are we going to get together? Do you want to watch the memorial, or are we going to Mount Rainier for the day? What are we doing? And I'm always like, I don't know. I have no idea how I'm going to feel on that day. I could wake up and be a wailing mess 20 years later and I could be totally fine. And, like, actually, I have to go to work today and live my normal life, but maybe I'll watch the video when I get home or something like that. And so I think as far as milestones go, I think it was less about grief milestones. So, like the first Christmas or like on June 3rd, but those bigger moments, like when I graduated and he's not in the audience or, all these different things. For me personally, I'm very grateful that I did have Dave at all of those things. And so having somebody having the father figure wasn't absent, I don't remember my school ever doing like donuts with dads or father-daughter, but if I had a father-daughter dance, I would have taken Dave. I would have danced with Dave and had a great time. And so I'm very thankful that for the majority of my life, I have had somebody. It wasn't this hole. It wasn't this absentee thing where, I can't go to donuts with dad because I don't have a dad. Dave would have gone with me. But at the same, that whole and concept of, even if Dave had been there were there for those things, it doesn't mean that it wasn't still devastating that my dad wasn't. My wedding in particular was really unique. My husband and I decided to get married after 6 weeks of dating.
Wow.
I'm a very decisive person. I know exactly what I want. And he did too. We were 25 and 26, and we were, he's a teacher, and we were dating in the spring. And it was like, well, it just makes sense for us to get married in the summer because you're a teacher and I'm not trying to do it in the school year. And it was like, well, we both know we want to get married to each other. So that means we either need to do it this summer or we need to wait until next year. But like, I'm not going to change my mind. Are you going to change your mind? And no, and I'm like, well, then we should just do it then. And so because of that, I did not have the time, the resources, the money, whatever, to organize a really big wedding, nor did I really want that anyway. So my whole childhood, I can't tell you how many Pinterest boards I had, how many journals I had about all these ways I was going to honor my dad, that I was going to wear, have a locket in my bouquet when I walked down the aisle, and that he was going to be there, that I was going to have a reserved seat for him in the front row that said reserved for John Cahill on it. And all of, I was going to do some sort of song for him, all these ways in a traditional wedding. But then I didn't end up doing that. And the problem of me getting walked down the aisle was solved because I didn't have an aisle. We got married in Mount Rainier. So we did it in the national park, which was awesome. So it was like, I'm literally surrounded by my dad's memorial. Like I'm in Mount Rainier.
That's amazing.
And I'm like, I don't really know how else I could draw attention to who John Cahill was.
Right. That's beautiful.
Getting married on the mountain.
Wow.
And both my parents, we had both sets of our parents because we didn't do a reception or have toast, or I didn't walk down the aisle, but it was important to me and to Dave that he still got to do something for me. And so we had both sets of our parents write out like kind of like a toast, a blessing that they spoke over us prior to the ceremony. So I was standing at the altar. It's like one of my favorite pictures from my wedding. It's not even of me and Caleb, that I'm like sobbing every time I look at it, because it's me and Dave holding hands and we're both crying. And my mom had written out this thing, and in it, she had talked about how special it was to have both my dads at this event, that I got to have to honor my dad by being in Mount Rainier, and that he was clearly everywhere around us, and that Dave was also here to literally hold my hand during the thing as well. And so, I'm definitely really curious to see how I handle parenting. I think that's been a lot harder as I've been pregnant than I anticipated it was going to be, as far as, oh my gosh, like my kid, what if he comes out with blonde hair and blue eyes and has my dad's name? And like, I struggle with feeling like I don't really know who he is. Like, where did I even come from? Why am I the way that I am? Because I'm also very similar to my mom in so many ways as well. People always say that like I am her carbon copy, and I feel so honored when people tell me that. But in so many ways, I'm also a carbon copy of my dad, but like, because I don't know him, I don't know that. And so when I was growing up as a teenager, and I had all of this fire and this passion and this energy and this love for adventure, but no one to teach me what to do with it. Like, I didn't have anybody in my life, because my mom is very much was the water to my dad's fire, that like, I didn't know what to do with all this fire that I had, because my mom's not like that. And Dave's not like that either. Dave is also water. And so I'm like, what do I do with all of this energy? And I don't know how to mold it. I don't know how to shape it. And I feel angry and I feel passionate with no way to direct all of this lightning I feel inside me. And that was hard for me. And so now that I'm becoming a parent, it's like, okay, because I am that way, if my son is similar in that way or does carry traits from my dad, I have some experience as an adult on being able to help him direct that lightning, but he'll never know like that legacy of where that comes from for himself. And so wanting to do my best to still, I'll be like, this is where that comes from. Like, this is where that legacy comes from, while also not forcing that image that, well, you have to be like him, or, we better do all of these things, but that he gets to be his own person. And that my son is also a Brasher, not a Cahill. And he'll always be a Cahill in so many ways.
Right.
But that he has his own legacy to live, and he will have his own family one day and his own traditions one day. And and then his kids, my son, or all my kids, future generations, there's going to come a day where John Cahill is not consistently honored and have his memory, but that who he is still going to be passed down in pieces and pieces and pieces, even if they're not recognized, in the same way that I now on earth carry traits of my great great grandparents who I've never known. I don't know who they are. I don't know where these things come from, but I think that's the beauty of legacy, is that even if there's not tangible evidence, or even if that person's not on earth, that they still continue to live on. And so walking into parenthood myself and trying to grasp that and knowing like what it'll be at my kids' milestones and what that will look like as well. When my nephew, Jonathan Cahill, was born, like literally, and I was at the birth, and the second that he came out and his first cry, my brother and I both were on either side of my sister-in-law, and we both burst into tears at the same time, and it was just this crazy moment that I don't think either of us anticipated feeling emotional. And not that that moment was about my dad at all, but like just having that, even that shared experience. And they're like, here's Jonathan. And it was just like, wow, what do you mean here's Jonathan? No one said that in 20 years. And, and then and then they were like, he has blue eyes. And we were like, what? Because my brother and his wife both have brown eyes and brown hair. And so it's like, you named him. Has blue eyes. Does she really? Yeah. Wow. Obviously never noticed that before. That's how often maybe I need to go have a conversation. But it was just really wild that it was like, what are the odds that they named him that? And then boom, he looks just like him. It was just this really out of world experience that I couldn't have anticipated on being a big moment for me, or a big grief moment for me, a big milestone moment for me. But I would say definitely there's been many, many, many random Tuesdays where I will just be out on a walk. And I'll just start crying. I'll just be like, dang, like I wish my dad were here right now. And I have a grief playlist on my phone. And there's been lots of times where I've just like been by myself and I just turn the playlist on and I just allow myself to sit in that. And I'll just listen and feel and cry. And then it's over. And then that's okay. And sometimes that lasts hours, and sometimes it's just one song. Sometimes I'll just feel like I need to listen to something. Yeah, I get it. And I'll listen to one song and it'll be 3 minutes and I'll be driving, and then you move on. But I would say by and large, a lot more of the pain or the sitting in, wow, that the reality that he's not here, that he's never going to be here again, way more often than not happens on a random Tuesday than it ever does at big moments.
Yeah.
Well, and I just wanted to address something too, backing up to childhood a little bit more. the perspective of all four of my kids is vastly different because of the ages that they were when their dad died. And also the nature of the relationship between sons and their dad and daughters and their dad. And both of my boys have said that they felt robbed of having a male role model in their life. Not that they absolutely love Dave, but it was 2.5 years after their dad died when I married Dave. And so during that time they had, they felt just kind of like they were robbed or like they were cheated of having a man, go through their life. And the interesting thing is that they both very specifically said they don't remember having anybody in their life. I don't remember it being that way nearly as much. There were definitely men that would come alongside our family and that were trying their best to help the boys to do, manly things and talk about stuff and throw a ball and all of that. But neither of my boys remember that.
Wow.
It doesn't feel that way.
It doesn't. Yeah.
It's like your perspective when it's not your dad. It doesn't matter who it is. Doesn't. And my dad's not here.
They both also said that the people that helped them the most during that time said the least.
Well, that's interesting.
They were very much, like I addressed in the previous podcast, practicing the ministry of presence. Just being there, just saying, I'm sorry, just laying a hand on their shoulder, just giving them a hug, just letting them cry in their presence without saying anything. And the people that they had the hardest time with were the ones that were trying to force the issue.
Right.
You have to talk about your dad. You have to do this. And they were not ready. And it made them bitter. And so much so that they have chosen to not even remember the fact that there were other male figures in their life trying to help, but they were not the right people. It wasn't their dad.
Right.
Which I think speaks to the fact that, everybody takes a grief journey differently.
Yes.
And, we like I said, we were 12, 10, 5, and 8. And being at those ages, you can't wrap your head around. So even if, I don't remember going to like a regular counselor, but if I had gone to a counselor as an 8-year-old and been asked to talk about these things, I don't know what I would have said. I don't know if that would have been helpful for me. My brothers were older. And so for them, they were not ready to talk about those things. And for me, years later, that's one of my biggest, like, gosh, if I could go back in time, I wish I would have had counseling. I wish I would have had a structured place to talk about it. Because when I was 14, 15 years old, obviously this is many years later, I was very angry and I did have a lot of big feelings that I didn't know what to do with them. And I didn't have counseling. I didn't have somebody to talk to. And the ministry of presence was a really big deal to me when I was 8, but I needed something different when I was older. And I've been to many counseling now, and I'm very passionate about therapy, and I still go to therapy weekly now. And, but not everybody's ready for that at different times. And it's hard when people try to force that, force counseling on somebody who's not ready for counseling. But I do also agree that at some point it is helpful. And a lot of people, I'm not ready right now. I'm like, it's okay that you're not ready right now, but I would encourage you to, at some point, seek that out, because we are going to grieve forever. And, I wasn't always going to be 8. At some point I was going to be 16. I was going to get married one day. There were going to come times and places in my life where I was going to need to talk about it. But everybody's on that journey differently. And because, you have 4 kids who all lost the same dad for the same reasons at the exact same time. And all 4 of us needed very different things at very different timelines, because we're 4 different people. We were in 4 different seasons of life. And so I think that's why, to a lot of us, that we didn't band together, but that we really drifted apart. And even to this day, like, we don't really talk about it. Like, as siblings, we don't get together to do things together because we grieved so differently and needed different things. And so I know both my brothers definitely felt like there were a lot of boxes or expectations that they should be in, that you should be talking about it, that you should be doing these things, when that wasn't something that they were ready or wanting at the time. And Kelly and I need different things, even though we're both girls, and my brothers needed different things, even though they're both boys. Like that, and my mom needed something different too, that there were 5 people that all went through the same thing that are impacted differently. And that, especially because for most people, that grief moment does happen on a random Tuesday, that it's not like, okay, well, it's June 3rd. So now we all need to get together and we all need to talk about it and we all need to have this catharsis together. It just isn't a realistic expectation, because there are 5 different grief journeys and there's 5 different personalities. There's 5 different relationship dynamics. The relationship that my oldest brother had with my dad is different than the relationship that I had with him. And the dreams or the aspirations or the future that we envisioned ourselves or the places that we saw him being are different for us as well. And being okay with the differences and knowing that, we're all going through this differently, and how do we move forward in a way that's healthy for where we're all at.
Wow.
And for just a, I guess more of a practical application for, this is for, I guess, for other widowers out there who have, are dealing with kids who have lost a parent. Both of my boys told me that the thing that they appreciated the most was having the opportunities to go do fun things, to just take their mind off of it for a little while.
That's good.
To just live with no expectations of having to talk about dad or talk about their feelings. That's just good. Be able to go and have fun. And the people that they appreciated the most were cognizant of that. They were intentional about taking them to do fun things and create those new memories with no expectations. And so just go, if you're dealing with, somebody who's has kids who are grieving the loss of their parent, just be there with them, take them out to lunch, take them to get ice cream. It doesn't have to be a long planned out ordeal. It's just an opportunity to just feel normal, to do something fun, to take your mind off of it, and to be there, to just sit there with them if it does turn into a powerful, gut-wrenching grief moment where they just need to cry.
I think that's a really good way to sum up what we were talking about earlier, as far as like it's the making space. It's when you try to force the silence, force like we're not talking about it, or force that we're talking about it. But when there's space to talk about it. I remember one year, the weekend of June 3rd, we had gone up to Mount Rainier. I remember my mom and there was a couple other people there. I think some of my friends. And it was like, we're just up here to be here. We're not up here to do a memorial thing. We're not up here to spread ashes or to do a poem, we're just here to just be here. And we just ate lunch at the Summit House on Crystal Mountain. And then we were sitting in the chairs. And then I remember I just asked my mom a really simple question, I think about it, which just led into a lot of conversation. And I remember hearing stories, and I was literally I remember at one point laughing and crying at the same time of just and that wasn't planned. It wasn't like we went up there to have a catharsis. We didn't go up there to have a grief moment, but we made space to just be together and to be in that place. And a lot of conversation naturally came out of that. And I've seen a lot of people where they try to force it one way or the, well, we're not here to talk about it. We're not going to do it. It's been a couple years, time to move on, get over it. Or it's, you have to talk about it, which I don't think is helpful either. But I think that sums it up really well, that what they were really talking about that they needed, and both what you were good at was, and allowing that space to exist always. That was 5 years ago or something like that. So it wasn't like that was 2 years afterwards. That to this day we make space. That's why there's, on June 3rd every year I make space to watch his memorial video. Some years I go up to the mountain, some years I don't. There's been several times that I've gone by myself and I've taken just a solo trip just to be up there. I know, my sister loves to go hiking, and she's a lot more athletic than me. And she can go on these really long hikes, and whether she's by herself or with my mom or with one other person, to just be there. And granted, not everybody has a national park as the grave site that they can go to, but whatever making space looks like, that whether it's been 5 minutes, and that's the number one advice I always tell people. I've sat with a lot of people who have lost, especially girls who have lost their dads.
Oh, wow.
And they, and then I always say, if I give you anything to walk away with, it's to let yourself grieve forever and to always make space for him.
So good.
That there's never going to come a time where you are obligated to no longer miss him as much or as deeply or as intensely, but that there's always going to be space for you to feel that. Because, and I think too, in the shock, when somebody initially dies, everybody's there with a meal, everybody's there with encouragement, people come to clean or whatever, but they're doing that when you're in shock.
Yeah.
And so it's helpful. It's not that it's not helpful, but like, they're only there, and then it's old news to everybody else.
Right.
And it's not old news to you. And so when it's been several years, and like for me, because I was a child and I couldn't grapple with big concepts until I was older. But when I was older, it was old news. And so there wasn't space among my peers or a place for me to go to counseling or to get help when I was finally able to confront those things, when the shock had worn off and when I was older. And so I always tell people that it's always okay to miss that person. It's always okay to make space for that person, because they will always be whoever they were to you. So for me, as my dad, he will always be my dad. So therefore there will always be space for me to miss my dad.
Right.
I love that. That's so beautiful.
And I just wanted to add to that, part of making space from the perspective of a parent who's helping kids through grief is that so much of that space needs to be child-led.
That's good.
So in their time and in their way. And all 4 of my kids, processed through their grief very differently. And there was not a box that I said, you have to do it this way.
Right.
You have to do it now. I remember the very first year, on the anniversary of his death, we went up to Mount Rainier, and that's where we scattered his ashes. And my oldest son brought a video camera, and he wanted to film it. And I had no idea that he was planning this, but he brought our family video camera and he filmed it. And he came home, and over the next, 3 weeks, a month, he put together this incredible video to music. And then just randomly said, "Hey Mom, I got to show you something." And I was blown away. He was 13 years old, and it was his way at that time of processing through his grief, through his eyes. And I gave him the space and the time to do that. I encouraged him. Like I said, they all have their different way of doing it,
right.
but providing that space is not, it's a hard concept, because some people might interpret the concept of making space as, okay, I'm going to create this box. I can make it as big as you need to be, but here are the boundaries for this box, and you have to do it within here. Other people can interpret it as being we're just going to shove you out of the nest and here you go. So providing space does not mean there's not guidance. It doesn't mean there's not leading questions. It doesn't mean there's not suggestions. It's just giving them the space to process in the way that they need to at that moment in time, because it's constantly going to be changing as they get older. And, like Katie was sharing the story about going up to Mount Rainier and just laughing and crying. She just asked me a question, and that just opened up the door for me just to share the memory. And it just, it provided that space, but it was just a simple question. And so it could be, you're just driving in the car. Maybe you just have one of your kiddos in the car. You could just say, "Hey, tell me what you remember about this camping trip that we went on, or do you remember this funny thing that happened?" And it's amazing how that opens up the door for that flood of memories, and how special it is for those kids to be able to process that out loud, freely, without any constraints, but without the pressure to have to respond immediately, or that demand for a response. And it always blew me away, and it still does to this day, how much kids understand about what's really going on. And yes, there are moments of confusion and age limited ability to process certain things, but kids understand and grasp so much more than people give them credit for.
Very true.
And, kids have to, I guess, making space, like Katie said, is just the best way to,
I love that,
to describe what that's like. Don't hold back from being honest about what you're feeling. Obviously, make your answers age appropriate to what they can understand at that time, but be honest. Don't sugarcoat things. Don't.
I've asked some hard questions.
Yeah, really hard.
Questions.
They all four of them have asked me really hard questions, and even in preparation for this podcast, I sent all of them some questions, and some of them were like, oh, here you go, and they just gave me lots of answers. Other ones took a long time to get back to me because they needed that time to process. And I asked them all, I said, be honest. Right. You're not going to hurt my feelings. Be bluntly honest about, what you're feeling. And I think there was, especially for my boys being the older ones, I will never forget this. I don't remember who the person was, but some well-intentioned person came alongside my oldest son. He was 12 years old, and said, "You're the man of the house now.
Someone said that to my son.
You need to step up."
No.
And
that was like worst advice. Yeah.
And I didn't know about it for a long time, but let me tell you, he took that to heart, and he took that burden of responsibility on himself to take care of me and to take care of his siblings. And it was like, when I found out about that, I had to sit him down and say, no, absolutely not. You are a kid. You have permission to be a kid. This is not your role. Exactly. It is not your responsibility. Do not take that upon yourself. And I'm so sorry that anybody said that to you. But it made a very long impact in his life. Yes. And even subconsciously, I think it's something that he still carries with him to this day, because in his mind, being the firstborn child and the firstborn son, it became his responsibility when his dad left him. And, so if I can give any advice to parents, don't ever say that to a child, a boy or a girl. Just don't say that, because that is not their role. It is not their responsibility. You have to help them grieve the loss of their parent while still being a child and behaving like a child and going through all of the normal things that a child goes through. Yes, all four of my kids grew up way too fast, way faster than than I wish that they had. But every one of them is wise beyond their years, because of what happened to them.
Exactly.
And so it's people tell me that all the time. Your kids are so wise. I can't believe it. And I'm like, well, trauma does that. But, I tried really, really hard to give them the space to be able to process through so many different things as they continued to grow, knowing that it was going to be a lifelong thing that they will carry with them forever. We don't ever stop missing that person. Grief is you're never done with grief. It can change, but it's always part of you. Yes. It doesn't mean that, your life can't be amazing. It can't be great. Right. It doesn't mean you don't have incredible joy. It's just, it becomes part of who you are.
Right.
And so giving the kids the space to grow with that and have room to grow with that as they're growing and maturing, and they're kids. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to deal with anger in poor ways. They're going to make great choices. They're going to make bad choices. Not any different than any other kid growing up. Right. It's tainted with this grief that's growing inside of them, that's, growing along with them. And they have to learn a healthy way to do that. And so that's the biggest challenge, I would say, for a parent, dealing with kids who are grieving the loss of their parent is learning how to do that side by side together, yet separately. Like Katie has said, it's five different, the nature of the relationship that each of us had with John was different.
Yeah.
And so we can't all grieve the same way. The timeline, that's great. I mean, for the most part is, 20 years is 20 years. It's been 20 years for all of us, but where we all are in our own grief journeys is different, and it will continue to be different as long as we're alive here on earth. So making the space for that is so important, and it's critical
beautiful.
for them to become healthy productive members of society and, and continue it on with the next generation.
Right.
Like we're
I
doing
love
now.
that. That's so beautiful and great advice from both of you to make this space. And Katie, I love how I've seen just from what you've shared, how this has shaped you. So an experience like this can make you bitter or better. And it's definitely made you better. I heard you talking about how you help other people. You're basically doing what your mom does she does it, helping widows, and you are helping the kids who have lost, someone. I think that's amazing that you're able to do that. And I can see it's definitely like matured you and yes, made you wise beyond your years. And I've loved just getting to know you. And I know so many people, both the parents and the kids, are going to find this very, very helpful. I've learned so much, Debbie, from your experience of 20 years of taking kids through it. I'm only 4 years in, and I'm learning so much about how I love that grow with them. And, it's been 4 years. So my youngest was 12. He's 16 now. It's going to look different. He's going to grieve differently than he did when he's 12. And so giving him the space, like he was one, I really wanted him to go to counseling, and he went once, wouldn't say a word when he was 12, but now he goes all the time and loves it. He had to grow, like he grew and changed. And so I love that advice. That's so, so huge to know that, your kids are growing and changing. And so they're going to need to process it differently as they get to different ages and as they become adults and all of that. So I've learned a lot just listening to you guys talk about this. And we'll wrap it up here in a second. But Katie, were there anything, I know it was like a long time period that you've been working through this, but any specific like verses or songs that stick out to you that have really helped you through your grief journey?
Yeah, absolutely. My sister shared the same thing when we were talking to my mom about it. But one of the his memorial song is "I Still Believe" by Jeremy Camp. So it's obviously a very old song at this point. But there's a nostalgia to it that's really special. And then, I think verses, I think there's so many out there, there's Psalm, 34:18, God is close to the brokenhearted, there's so many out there. I think for me, the one that's been the most popular, I have tattooed on the other arm. So I have climb high on one side, and then I have the Roman numerals for John 16:33, which is take heart, I have overcome the world.
Oh, that's good.
But the word overcome in original Greek is, I can't say it, nanika, I can't say it, but it's in perfect tense, which means that when Jesus said that, he's saying, I did overcome, I am overcoming, and I always will overcome. It's a perfect tense in the sense that God has always he will always win. And I think I've really held on to that my whole life. Even when I was a teenager, I always knew that I wanted to get that tattooed. I said, I'll get the word overcome tattooed or something of what that means to me. And it was the first tattoo I ever got when I turned 18. And it's my favorite because I think it's always on my arm that tells me and reminds me. And when people ask me about it, that no matter how dark it feels, that God always wins.
So
no matter what the grief is, no matter the pain, and not just about losing my dad, but anything in life, that no matter how bad it is circumstantially, no matter how overwhelming it is, that there is a finality and a truth to the fact that God always wins, that he is always victorious. And for me personally, I find so much peace knowing that my dad knew and loved Jesus and that he's in heaven and that I will see him again someday, that my goodbye is not eternal, but that I do get to spend eternity with him someday. But on earth, while I am in this place, and my mom always said, growing up, I would never wish your dad out of heaven for 1 second. And that's just such a love, that she's been able to share. And so for me to be able to hold on to that as well, knowing that, that I would also never wish my dad out of heaven for 1 second, and clinging to not even particular verses, but just clinging to scripture, clinging to truth, that, that God is victorious about what it means to have a savior in my life, that I can't do it on my own, that in my weakness, that I suffer, that life is hard. And even if I had never lost my dad, or life is hard, and that's not the last hard thing that I went through, and I'm going to continue to grieve and suffer because thus is humanity. But that I can always go back to scripture. And I just love listening to worship music in general. I have different worship playlists, just being able to sit in God's presence, knowing that regardless of what I'm going through, that he is a comforter and that he is with me, that he's not surprised. It didn't catch him off guard when my dad died. I may have been in shock, but he wasn't. That he was always aware, and that him me feeling so out of control in life and being somebody who does struggle with an immense amount of anxiety and control issues, which I inherited from this woman for similar reasons, because trauma, but that knowing that God is always in control.
Yeah,
and there's
good.
So many passages of scripture and verses that speak to that, knowing that I can always have trust that even when I don't feel okay, or even when life is not going well for me, or that I feel out of control or anxious, that God is always peace, that he is always love, he is
so
always
good.
calm, he is always victorious, and that I can rest in his truth at any time.
Good.
Like Katie's been saying, there's so many, and we're happy to compile a list for you if you want to post them somewhere. But
that would be great.
Yeah, there's just a couple that I can think of offhand for young kids. I shared about this in the previous podcast. Young kids, especially, in the beginning, dealing with the loss of the parent early on, kids are afraid often that death is contagious.
Yes.
Or it might happen to them. They're afraid to go to sleep, thinking that they'll never wake up. They're afraid to have their remaining parent go to sleep, thinking that they're never going to wake up. And so I taught my kids, probably from the time they could speak, Psalm 4:8, which says, "I will lie down in peaceful rest and sleep, for you, O Lord, make me dwell in safety." And so it was fantastic for them when they were having those scary dreams, thinking that death was catching or something was going to happen to them.
Right.
And they would just, I'd sit by them and we would just say it out loud over and over again. And then they could lay back down and rest in peace.
I feel like too, as a child, like I said, when I fell in love with Harry Potter when I was 10 years old, I think stories were really important to me to be able to process. It's almost like a running joke in most young adult fiction that the parents are either already dead or they die by the end of one of the books. But I found a lot of solace in that I wasn't old enough to be able to process through some of those big things. Now as an adult, I can read scripture and think about these really heavy concepts that I can understand what it means that I'll see my dad in heaven one day and but when I was younger, I couldn't necessarily wrap my head around that, but having something that made sense. So stories were just really important to me. I did a lot of reading, being able to have things that helped, that I identified with it, and even movies or whatever, just that allowing there to be space for being like, yeah, I know what that feels like, even if I can't wrap my head around that. And so to this day, I'm super passionate about reading and writing and storytelling because that made such a difference for me in my youth growing up, of what storytelling can do to help people relate to one another and to human experiences that is sometimes hard to put in words or even hard to face. Sometimes maybe I'm not ready to face that thing and talk about it directly, but I can read about someone else's experience or read books and stories and feel like I'm not so alone in the world, even if I'm not ready to face that myself yet.
So good. Well, thank you. Well, this has been amazing. I mean, like I said, I've learned a lot. I know this is going to help so many people. Thank you both for being willing to take your time to share with others and let this go all over the world. We're in like 80 some countries, so it's going to touch people's lives all over. And I'd love to close us in prayer, if that's all right with you guys.
Absolutely.
All right. Jesus, we just thank you so much for Katie and for Debbie, for them taking their time to do this. God, I just pray that their words will go out to so many people and be able to help them. I just pray for their whole family, that they'll continue to draw near to you. And we pray for this new baby boy, pray for health over his life and a good birth and for all of that. And pray for the listeners, God, that they can draw close to you. And I just pray for the peace that passes all understanding to cover their hearts and minds, God, and that you will meet them in a new way today, and that they will see you all around and you will bring peace into their lives, God. And we just thank you for another day to be alive. Amen. Well, if you guys like this podcast, give it a little bing, 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. please join our Widow Too Soon community. There's a link in the show notes. It's growing like crazy. We grew 1,000 in the last week, which is just nuts. Thank you, Debbie. You've been doing a great job. I see you like commenting. I'm like, I didn't even get to comment all these, and you're always commenting and welcoming people. So thank you so much for helping us with that community. So if you, as a listener, want to plug in, that's a great place. The link is below. So thank you guys for being here so much. We appreciate it. And we will see you all next time. Bye.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Widowed Too Soon with Michelle Bader Ebersole. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe, rate and review. And we'd also love for you to join our Widowed Too Soon community on Facebook. See you next time.